useful for like 20 minutes.
Well, greetings, good people. I'm glad everybody's made it here for our last panel of the day. And this is the panel titled Mostly Nosferatu, excuse me. So our panelists are Miranda Corcoran, Jose Nateras, and Rosa Scupine. Scupine. I keep messing it up. My bad, Rosa. But anyway, we'll begin with Miranda Corcoran's work. If you lose control in your life, you can find control in your food, Vampiric Nourishment, and Anorexic Logic, and Khoda's Woman Eating. Miranda is a lecturer in the Department of English, University College Cork, excuse me. She is the author of Witchcraft and Adolescence in American Popular Culture, and the editor of Satanism and Feminism in Popular Culture, very cool. She is also co-editor of the journal Shirley Jackson Studies and chair of the Irish Association for American Studies. Now we present Miranda.
To consume or abstain from human food is an ethical stance, an indication that the vampire in question is grappling with the moral implications of an eternal life contingent upon the consumption of other lives. In Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire and its various screen adaptations, protagonist Louis Dupont du Lac initially chooses to subsist on rats rather than take a human life. In Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Ensouled Vampire Angel takes his meals from blood banks, and in the Twilight series, Edward Cullen describes himself as a vegetarian because he exclusively drinks animal as opposed to human blood. That makes no sense, but anyway. Such dietary regulations are largely the province of male vampires, often tormented by Byronic heroes whose refusal to feed on humans reflects broader philosophical or moral concerns. Conversely, female vampires, from Bram Stoker's voluptuous Lucy to Rice's ravenous vampire child Claudia, are typically associated with excessive, inappropriate appetites. In this paper, I would like to add to and complicate the familiar canon of voracious 19th and 20th century female vampires by exploring a 21st century text, Claire Khoda's 2022 novel Woman Eating, that centers a female vampire who refuses to eat humans, instead carefully monitoring and ritualizing her meager consumption of animal blood. I will argue that rather than constituting a moral choice, like the male vampires just mentioned, Khoda's vampire, a young woman of color, instead engages in practices and displays symptoms consistent with anorexia nervosa. Utilizing Leslie Haywood's theorization of anorexic logic, defined as a set of assumptions crucial to the logic of assimilation that values mind over body, thin over fat, white over black, masculine over feminine, individual over community, I will explore how Khoda employs food refusal and hunger as thematic nodes around which she assembles a number of broader concerns with racial identity and sexuality and economic precarity. Anorexia nervosa is categorized in the DSM-5 as a feeding and eating disorder, categorized by the restriction of energy intake relevant to requirements, as well as an intense fear of weight gain and a sense of feeling disturbed by one's own body weight or shape. As a diagnostic category, anorexia was first identified in the 19th century, just at the same moment when, according to Michel Foucault, new scientific disciplines were beginning to medicalize abnormal behaviors. Yet, while anorexia has a very real history as a disease and the most fatal of all mental illnesses, it is also defined, as Haywood notes, by its very malleability as a trope. In the Victorian period, when the disorder was first categorized, hunger and appetite were embedded in a moral framework that conceived of moderation and slenderness as emblematic of true womanhood. Anna Karugovoy-Silver observes that during the 19th century, the good woman, quotation marks, really awkward to do with one hand, was believed to be more spiritual and less carnal than men. It was understood that the slender body corporealizes this self-mastery and or spirituality, and that slenderness carries particular class connotations and most often is a sign of a woman's affluence. Moreover, as Haywood argues, anorexia is bound up with the Western philosophical, religious, and literary tradition that defines femininity and materiality as its principal others, and reflects the ways in which gender otherness is compounded by sexual orientation or race or class position that is deemed other by the dominant culture. Thus, subordinated or marginalized cultural positions are frequently aligned with excessive corporeality that must be annihilated in order to ensure that the attenuated form that remains is sexually and racially pure. In the Victorian period, just as anorexia nervosa was being formulated as a medical disorder, female vampires served as monstrous incarnations of unbound appetite and fleshly lust. Karugovoy-Silver remarks on the ubiquity of the female vampire at this time, observing that, except for the figure of Dracula himself, the female vampire, not the male, dominated the late 19th century literary imagination, thereby placing female hunger at the center of the literature of horror. Emma Dominguez Rue argues that in Bram Stoker's Dracula, where the only male vampire is the eponymous Count, female vampires embody a voracious carnivorous hunger and an equally voracious sexuality. The word most commonly applied to the novel's vampiric women is voluptuous. The three weird sisters who seduce Jonathan are possessed of voluptuous red lips and full bodies, while Lucy Westenra, once she transforms into a vampire, is described as displaying a voluptuous wantonness. Even their literary antecedent, Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, possesses a voracious appetite that gives lie to her delicate frame. As Cora Govoy Silver points out, while Carmilla appears to subsist solely upon a cup of hot chocolate per day, her fasting conceals a monstrous appetite that manifests in her capacity to transform into an enormous black cat and a great palpitating mass that affixes itself to her victim's throat. These monstrous women, with their immense hunger for blood, which maps itself quite easily onto an equally disconcerting sexual appetite, function as grotesque inversions of the ideal 19th century woman, pure, spiritual, restrained, and slight. Later portrayals of the female vampire are similarly marked by an insatiable appetite. Anne Rice's vampire child Claudia is possessed of a hunger that cannot be satisfied. Sandra Tomk notes that Claudia gets hungrier and hungrier without ever getting physically full. Her soul keeps expanding until her minuscule shape harbors an eerie and powerful seductress. Contemporary young adult fiction and television similarly portray female vampires' appetites as monstrous and destabilizing. Dinah Pedro observes how in The Vampire Diaries, good, again my awkward one-handed quotation marks, good vampire girls control their appetites while their bad counterparts feast lavishly on blood. These ravenous girls, Pedro notes, have to be killed or cured due to their immorality and incapacity to control their impulses. Claire Khoda's novel, Woman Eating, serves as an intriguing coda to this centuries-old lineage of perverse, gluttonous female vampires. Where her predecessors were characterized primarily by a powerful need to gratify their all-consuming hunger, Khoda's protagonist, Lydia, is motivated by a compulsive need to abstain from human blood. She structures her existence around alternative sources of nourishment. Pig's blood procured from a local butcher, or fragments of blood sucked from black puddings and sausages. And you can tell it's a British novel because of the disgusting meat products that appear regularly in it. When she's unable to locate these foods, she starves, confining herself to a tiny artist's studio where she binges episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and somewhat masochistically watches endless What I Eat in a Day videos on YouTube. Lydia's peculiar dietary habits were imparted to her by her mother, a Malaysian woman who believes herself to also be a vampire, having been bitten and transformed centuries ago by a British colonizer. As a child, Lydia's mother told her that the two of them must subsist on animal blood because as demons, they are unworthy of anything more satisfying. She always said that she didn't deserve things. She didn't deserve to feel satiated, to try the blood of a nobler animal than the pig, such as the horse, even the cow. She didn't deserve happiness. Lydia believes that because her mother turned her as a baby, she will grow only until young adulthood. However, her mother is clearly aging, showing signs of early onset Alzheimer's that result in her confinement to a nursing home. Now, although none of the reviews of the novel I've found so far have touched on this possibility, my reading of the text is that Lydia, like the protagonist of George A. Romero's 1977 film Martin, is not really a vampire, but has instead been raised in an insular environment where fantasies of sin, demons, and the undead have supplanted mundane reality. Lydia's vampire identity, which she views, likely through the lens of the Buffy mythos, as split between human and demon selves, functions as a conceptual framework through which she attempts to navigate her mixed race identity, Malaysian on her mother's side and Japanese on her father's, and her working class background. Her vampirism thus emerges as a patchwork of marginal identities, somewhat akin to Jack Halberstam's Gothic monster, an economic form that condenses various racial and sexual threats to nation, capitalism, and the bourgeoisie in one body. However, rather than her various monsterized identities functioning as a threat to the white British social order she inhabits, Lydia's marginal identities constitute parts of herself that she wishes to annihilate through starvation and the destruction of her demon half. Lydia's vampirism and her strict pig's blood diet echo a number of the symptoms and signifiers of anorexia. She is constantly icy cold, regardless of the temperature. She explains that her skin doesn't retain heat. It's more like how leather can be warmed up next to a heater. But once it's taken away from the heat source, it'll quite quickly cool down. She also notes that she doesn't menstruate. Amenorrhea, like feelings of coldness, is a common symptom of anorexia. And she doesn't believe that the womb I have in me, that has been the womb of a vampire since I was turned as a baby, would support life at all. I never get my period. When she can no longer access her supply of pig's blood, she begins to starve and imagines that the lack of blood will annihilate her demon half, killing those undesirable facets of herself, rendering her pure, white, and clean. That the destruction of her demon self is linked to an ambivalent conceptualization of her racial identity becomes apparent in her description of how sunlight affects her vampire body. She says, "My skin burns as if it has no pigment at all, as if I'm without any melanin, as if I'm completely and purely white." In order to prevent this painful searing of her flesh, Lydia is forced to avoid sunlight and cover her body in sunscreen, ensuring that her skin is not tainted by the sun, but remains as close to pure whiteness as possible. Lydia's vampirism is also bound up with a painful history of colonization. Her mother's maker was a white British man who had arrived in Malaysia as part of a colonizing power, a man who took so much that was not his, took others' homes, possessions, livestock, farms, bodies, that he stopped being able to nourish his own body with food. In this way, vampirism, Lydia's demon half, is not simply an embodiment of racial difference, it is, for her, an instantiation of colonialist exploitation and racist violence. At the same time, Khoda imagines vampires as a way of thinking through class identity and economic inequality. Although Lydia's now deceased father was a well-known artist, she and her mother lived for much of their lives in Margate, a largely working-class seaside town, supporting themselves with a dwindling income from the sale of his canvases. After graduating with a degree in art, Lydia takes on a role as an unpaid intern in a London art gallery and rents a studio space nearby. While the other tenants of the building use their studios solely for work, Lydia finds herself living in her small, windowless space, unable to afford an apartment. Reflecting on her financial situation, Lydia wonders, how is it that vampires in all the books and films and TV programs always seem to be so successful and wealthy, and able to rent or even buy studios, flats, houses, sometimes whole estates? Lydia's vampirism does not empower her to transcend her class status, but instead seems to reinforce her disenfranchisement, while her undead nature, caught between the living and the dead, instantiates the uncertainty associated with economic precarity. In such a liminal state, one works to sustain life, but can never really live beyond this subsistence level. From Marx's description of capital as dead labor that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labor, to the vampiric plantation owners of Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, creatures of the night are commonly portrayed as exploiters, capitalists, aristocrats, colonizers. However, Lydia is herself exploited and abused by those who inhabit privileged social positions. And in this way, the identity of the vampire is in fact refracted, projected onto other, more nefarious characters. While Lydia believes herself to be a real vampire, other characters are far more monstrous and bloodthirsty. When Lydia commences her internship at the trendy OTA gallery, she is sexually harassed by the owner Gideon, a man who, Khoda implies, regularly assaults young female interns. Lydia reflects that Gideon looks like what a normal person might expect a vampire to look like. It's not his clothes this time, but his sallow, corpse-like form, his breathing, or rather lack of breath. Thus, the identity of the vampire is projected onto Gideon, who is not just a predator, but a colonizer in his own right, consuming the art and traditions of other cultures, hollowing them out for profit, or secreting them away in his private collection. In considering the relationship between Lydia's vampirism, her racial and socioeconomic identities, and her compulsive fasting, it is useful to again return to Haywood's theory of anorexic logic. For Haywood, anorexia is not simply an isolated illness, nor is it merely the product of the increasingly exacting media-generated beauty standards. Instead, it is a mode of thought grounded in a Western philosophical system structured around the irreconcilable opposition of binary categories. Within this framework, not only is the body positioned as the inferior pole in the corporeal spiritual binary, but this oppositional system is invariably raced, sexed, and classed. The body, with its base desires, is aligned with women, the working class, and those perceived as racial others, while the mind is associated with masculinity, whiteness, and self-mastery. While such framing of the body as inferior and other has its roots in Aristotelian philosophy, the development of race science and the concomitant construction of racial hierarchies during the Enlightenment created a new political narrative in which, as Sabrina Strings notes, slenderness served as a marker of moral, racial, and national superiority, while an excess of flesh was viewed to connote an inferior race and class status. As she starves away her body and her so-called demon half, Lydia attempts to align herself with the intellectual or spiritual side, read also white, middle class, and male, of the mind-body divide. She notes that fasting and the control of one's diet imparts a degree of self-mastery, a sense that intellect and will have won out over body and desire. Watching videos of influencers on YouTube, Lydia notes that there's also clean food and dirty food. If you eat clean, the message is that you are a clean and pure person. If you eat dirty, then the message is that you are dirty and impure. If you lose control in your life, you can find control in your food. Lydia's commitment to her pig's blood diet thus assumes a moral and indeed racialized aspect. If she drinks only the blood of animals, if she starves herself to the degree that her demon half wastes away, she too can be categorically pure. In the novel's closing pages, however, Lydia's appetite is ultimately victorious. She becomes ravenous like her vampiric precursors and devours Gideon. She claims to taste his memories, the life he has lived, and all the foods he has eaten. She finds pleasure in vampirism and sating her appetite. In this way, Lydia's characterization might initially appear indebted to the anorexic logic that informed her 19th and 20th century precursors. She starves to annihilate a corporeality that is invariably classed, raced, and sexed. And when she finally feeds, she does so in a monstrous excess of gore. Yet, rather than a repulsive spectacle that reinforces Lydia's position as other, her consumption of Gideon, presented through Lydia's first-person narrative perspective as a torrent of flavors and sensations, becomes a joyous embrace of alterity. Rather than striving to annihilate her flesh, and with it the monsterized identities it houses, she willingly inhabits a selfhood that is fluid and contiguous, rather than riven by binary oppositions and fragmented by hierarchical categories of being. Thank you.
Well done, Miranda. Our next piece is by Jose Nateras. Jose Nateras is a PhD student at the University of California, Los Angeles in theater and performance studies. Nateras has his BA in theater from Loyola University Chicago and his MFA in writing from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. His research concerns the performance of horror, particularly the vampire as counter-performance, and the title of his paper is Revising Undead Bodies, Nosferatu, and the Reconstitution of Other Flesh.
Okie dokie. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you all. As mentioned, my name is Jose. I am a theater and performance studies PhD student at UCLA, and this conference paper is entitled Revising Undead Bodies, Nosferatu 2024, and the Reconstitution of Othered Flesh. A brief content warning. This presentation will include discussions of male genitalia, specifically the practice of circumcision, and there will be a few images from the 2024 movie. So, to get things started. Since its inception, the text of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula has built on European folkloric traditions to manufacture an embodiment of otherness partly rooted in xenophobia and anti-Semitism. In 1922, German director F.W. Murnau created an unauthorized adaptation of Stoker's work, reifying a connection between the vampire and anti-Semitism with his film Nosferatu, a symphony of horror. In scholar Jeffrey Weinstock's 2001 essay entitled Circumcising Dracula, Weinstock draws connections between histories of blood libel, the anti-Semitic subjugation of Jews in Europe, and vampiric folklore traditions and depictions in media to argue, quote, the Jew is explicitly identified as a vampire, and, even in contemporary retellings, anti-Semitism remains operative if implicit within the figure and field of the vampire, end quote. Over 2 decades later, the moving target of what qualifies as contemporary retelling calls into consideration whether or not Weinstock's assertion holds, particularly considering his title's invocation of circumcision in direct conversation with Robert Eggers' 2024 adaptation of Nosferatu. While Weinstock uses Murnau's 1922 version to support the connections drawn between anti-Semitism and the vampire, Eggers' decision to depict the naked body of his titular vampire, revealing an explicitly uncircumcised penis, acts to revise the way in which the vampiric body is used to constitute otherness. The revisability of the vampire's body is a key part of why it has been an enduring figure within Western culture. I am interested in considering how a closer examination of the vampiric body can make room to revise our relationship to the fears and anxieties it represents and produces. Monsters, such as the vampire, have long been used to dehumanize the other. While the results of dehumanization, namely the subjugation, degradation, abuse, and killing of those deemed as less than or other than human, is a negative effect, dehumanization also functions to enshrine humanity. Scholar Zakiya Iman Jackson notes, quote, what is commonly deemed dehumanization is, in the main, more accurately interpreted as the violence of humanization or the burden of inclusion into a racially hierarchized universal humanity, end quote. Racialized minorities are deserving of life, regardless of any attempt at categorizing us as less human than a white majority. I am intrigued by Jackson's proposal that, quote, only by questioning, rather than presupposing, the virtuousness of human recognition will we be able to develop a praxis of being that is not only an alternative to the necropolitical, but opposes it. For me, the vampire digs out the space to perform such questioning. The idea that an undead being might be able to oppose the necropolitical is an interesting one. Weinstock's essay dives into the historical record to provide specific examples where blood libel, accusations of ritual murder with its vampiric associations, per Weinstock, were used to justify the dehumanization and unjust execution of Jews in Europe. However, the important distinction here lies in the fact that these acts of anti-Semitic violence were predicated on scapegoating, and specifically unfounded murder charges, often reported regarding the murder of Christian children. Such charges were distinct from the specific phenomenon of reported vampiric activity, which were handled differently in according with this distinction. In The Monster in Theater History, Michael Chemers illustrates how Europeans dealt with reports of vampires through corpse desecration. Chemers mentions 2 specific examples amongst some others, but these were particularly of Austrian military reports from the 18th century, wherein medical authors documented a group of Serbians who, quote, disinterred dead bodies, driving stakes through them and burning them in response to the belief that the corpses were climbing out of their graves at night and spreading a wasting disease. End quote. Weinstock reports on 150 occasions between the 12th and 20th century, accusations of blood libel led to Jewish community members being arrested, tortured, and executed. It is clear in these cases, Jewish or Europeans are being denied the right to life. They are marked and classified as the other, but this other is not only apart from European Christians, it is also from these corpses that were deemed to be vampires. Foucault's Discipline and Punish parallels the history of both Weinstock and Chemers. Here is a quote, which I will give you a quick second to look at, from Discipline and Punish. And that's a picture of Angel from Buffy. In chains. So, for Foucault, the relationship between the body and power is important to understanding systems within society, particularly these systems of punishment, whether those systems are violent and bloody or centered on confinement and surveillance. The desecration of a corpse deemed to be a slumbering vampire is ceremonial, perform ceremonies. A Jewish body accused of blood libel is tortured into confessing. And this confession is not to being a vampire or even to being Jewish, but to having committed specific crimes that they did not do. Within the political field, power exerted through torture marked the Jewish body, turning it into a sign emitting a story of Jewish guilt, which was then used to justify the continued practice of scapegoating Jewish communities. Power reconfigures these bodies into signs to be read. Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's first of 7 theses that forms the foundation of monster studies is the monster's body is a cultural body, which asserts, quote, the monstrous body is pure culture, a construct and a projection. The monster exists only to be read, end quote. Following this line of thought, power makes, or at least has the capacity to make monsters of us all. However, already a monster, the vampire transforms at will, revising itself into new symbols that, per Cohen, signifies something other than itself. So, while the Jewish body may be bound as a subject to a knowledge of the body Foucault describes in terms of a, quote, political technology of the body, a vampire body challenges the powers that be to try decoding it as a glyph that seeks a hierophant, per Cohen. While there are technologies through which a Jewish body might be identified as such, in the title of Weinstock's essay, he specifically invokes circumcision as one such technology, a vampire's body changes and therefore must be identified through their performance of vampiric acts. Although I am not trying to sensationalize the penis or the subject of circumcision, as a symbol, the phallus is a particularly evocative one. Within mainstream Western media, on-screen depictions of the penis are far rarer than those of the buttocks, breasts, or even the vagina. And although seeing a penis on screen is becoming more common, they are typically intended to be shocking when they are shown either for comedic effect or to disturb, especially in the context of horror narratives. It is rare for them to be depicted on screen outside of pornography or erotic cinema within the context of a typical sex scene. Perhaps this is what makes the title of Weinstock's essay so evocative. Interestingly, though, the text itself of Circumcising Dracula has little, if any, significant mention at all to circumcision or the penis. This would seem to indicate that Weinstock's title invokes the practice in more figurative terms. Weinstock's use of circumcision is a way of identifying or knowing a body as being Jewish. So we're going to start to get into some specifics here. As mentioned previously, in the vampire in 2024's Nosferatu is specifically depicted as being uncircumcised. So while Weinstock is able to engage with the practice of circumcision more figuratively, I have to consider it a little bit more literally. While yes, circumcision is a practice with specific ties to Judaism, it is inaccurate to claim that only Jewish penises are circumcised. Scholar Peter Agleton's essay, Just a Snip, A Social History of Circumcision, provides some valuable context for the practice outside of Judaism. According to Agleton, beyond, quote, being a simple technical act, it is a practice which carries with it a whole host of social meanings. For Agleton, one of the more important functions of circumcisions is as a, quote, potent indicator of hierarchy and social difference. Agleton notes, not only in Nazi Germany, but during the Ottoman and Moorish empires, genocides in Bosnia and East Timor, as well as during the partition in India, a man's circumcision status had serious consequences for how he was treated, with violence, torture, and death being the consequence for those who fell short of the mark, end quote. Agleton's paper continually reiterates circumcision, quote, is nearly always a strongly political act, enacted upon others by those with power, in the broader interests of a public good, but with profound individual and social consequences, end quote. Circumcision is a political act that marks the body as different or the same. It is an act of making, of meaning making, of generating significance. A penis is no longer just a penis, it is a categorical indicator. A circumcised penis becomes a sign to be read. Its generative capacity makes circumcision a technology all on its own. By transforming the body's flesh into such a sign, the technology of circumcision supports Foucault's discussion of power and knowledge relations that invest human bodies and subjugates them by turning them into objects of knowledge. While Weinstock might read a circumcised penis as a marker of Jewish identity, it might also be read as an inherited marker that tracks beyond Judaism. Typically, most circumcised individuals undergo the procedure as infants, meaning it is performed at the behest of their parents. Regardless of the subject's Jewishness, most times a child is circumcised, it is because the father is. Circumcision is an act of making. An uncircumcised penis is made into a circumcised one. A child's flesh is remade in the image of their father. Heidegger talks about technology in terms of poiesis, making or bringing something forth, and techne, knowing or understanding. For Heidegger, quote, technology is a mode of revealing, and beyond the literal revealing of part of the organ the procedure involves, circumcision reveals or makes known that the owner of said organ belongs to a certain group. However, circumcision is not the only technology at play in this conversation. Similar to Weinstock, the impetus for Jack Halberstam's 1993 essay, Technologies of Monstrosity, Bram Stoker's Dracula, came from an observed connection between Dracula and anti-Semitism. However, where Weinstock seems more committed to stabilizing the relationship between Jewishness and the vampire, Halberstam takes a deeper dive, which analyzes the very production of monstrosity, linking the two in the first place. Here is a brief quotation from Technologies of Monstrosity, kind of explaining the move away from essentializing this connection, right? Halberstam also calls upon Foucault to discuss how technologies of monstrosity are always also technologies of sex. Importantly, Halberstam doesn't entirely abandon his initial conclusions regarding the relationship between anti-Semitism and the vampire, rather going deeper to see how anti-Semitism is a cog in a larger monstrousness-generating machine containing anti-Semitism as a part of its composition. While Weinstock argues that the, quote, categories of vampirism and anti-Semitism must be considered as having developed together symbiotically, end quote. The issue with this argument is that it has potential essentialist organic implications suggesting the notion of symbiotic development. Per Halberstam, the textual medium of the Gothic novel lays bare distinct, quote, mechanisms of monster production. While Weinstock might argue the symbiotic relationship between anti-Semitism and the vampire is still on display in contemporary adaptations, it would seem that Eggers' recent adaptation, through the decisions of what to literally lay bare, reveals something different going on. So, with regards to Eggers' Nosferatu, Halberstam's considerations of monstrous technologies more effectively address the construction of monstrousness at work in contemporary retellings of vampire narratives, rather than simply presupposing readings of symbiosis between the vampire and anti-Semitism. I would argue, although Weinstock accurately analyzes the anti-Semitic fears embodied in Nosferatu, A Symphony of Terror, 2024's Nosferatu revises the vampiric body to instead be read as a critique of ancient, rotting forms of masculinity which condemn female bodies to the confines of outdated, heteropatriarchal societal norms in which they are no more than a commodity to be owned, sold, and discarded. The genealogy of Robert Eggers' 2024 version includes Werner Herzog's adaptation from the 70s, the initial F.W. Murnau's version from 1922, as well as Stoker's novel. Weinstock's Circumcising Dracula engages specifically with Murnau's film, in particular the aesthetics this film uses to depict his version of Count Orlok. Weinstock accurately describes this Orlok, played here by Max Schreck, as featuring, quote, exaggerated stereotypical Jewish features, such as his disproportionately large hook nose and heavy eyebrows, end quote. While Murnau's Nosferatu can be read as a circumcision, in that it marks the vampire's body as identifiably Jewish, Eggers' decision to explicitly depict an uncircumcised Orlok is instead marking this vampire as specifically not Jewish. The revision of the vampire body through this restoration of the metaphorically removed foreskin changes its meaning. This sign has been rewritten and therefore must be read for new significations. Interestingly, Eggers' additional tweaks to the aesthetic depictions of Orlok's body further shift the implications of his monstrousness. In the 2024 rendition, Orlok is a towering, eyebrowless, mustachioed figure with a swoop of hair modeled after period-accurate depictions of a Transylvanian/Hungarian count from around 1580. As further explained by costume designer Linda Muir, we see a quotation here from an interview, as well as on the next slide I'll be showing, which show how Linda Muir and Robert Eggers pay particular attention to detail and historic cultural reality, which generates a sense of the monstrous that emerges from specificity as opposed to stereotypes, general conceptions of otherness, and anti-Semitic caricature. The truth of Orlok's decayed, rotting body is eventually put on full display at a couple of different moments throughout the narrative. Eggers makes a point of showcasing vampiric flesh throughout the film. So when Nicholas Holt's Joseph Hutter discovers Count Orlok in his coffin, he is an immobile corpse that is lying still until the sun sets. As a corpse, Orlok lies unmoving, maggots crawling on his rotting flesh, rats crawling among his shriveled legs. Before Hutter can perform the penetrative act of impaling the vampire with a stake, the sun sets, and Orlok rises from the dirt of his coffin. It is at this moment that his naked body is on full display. Although Hutter flees, he cannot escape, and he is subsequently fed upon by Orlok. He lies prone as the naked Orlok mounts him, feeding from him. Oh, this should play automatically, but... this is just a clip of him being fed upon. Doesn't really matter. Just imagine what I'm about to describe. Okay. Sorry, I gotta close this out. Okay. So he feeds upon him. He feeds upon him specifically from his chest, with the naked Orlok writhing rhythmically, one hand cupped around Hutter's jaw. It is both erotic and repulsive. As Orlok performs his vampiric act of feeding, his undead, rotting flesh expose the monstrous mechanics at work in this film in full gear. Eggers' film employs monstrous technologies to generate a vampire whose produced monstrousness is more concerned with sex, gender, and flesh/the body than it is with xenophobia. Eggers' version also centralizes a woman's relationship with her own body throughout the narrative. We have Ellen, played by Lily Rose Depp. There we go. Played by Lily Rose Depp, and she's established as having an innate psychic ability. She is inherently uncanny and is quickly established as not fitting in within the society of early 19th century Germany. She is designated as belonging to the world of the unnatural. This innate otherness leads to the bond between her and Orlok prior to her marriage to Hutter. Repeatedly, Ellen is depicted distorting her body physically, contorting her face, and rending her garments. She has seizures and experiences corporeal orgasms, disturbing the German nobility with whom she is staying. Grounded in the realities of the early 19th century, she is treated by doctors who tie her to the bed and portray her other than natural ways of knowing, embodied and otherwise, as signs of madness. So while Weinstock notes that the original film is structured so that, quote, the salvation of the German people is left to the young, pure German woman, end quote, in the 2024 version, this is subverted. The seed of Orlok's obsession with Ellen is rooted in the systemic othering of a young woman and her non-normative agency. While Ellen still ends up saving the German people at the film's climax by sacrificing herself to Orlok's appetites, it is her own appetites, left unsatisfied due to the social constraints of her environment, that are the root cause of the city's endangerment, as well as what empowers her to bring forth Orlok's demise. Eggers' employment of the technologies at his disposal both depict the vampire as an embodiment of disease, death, and sex, and a means of depicting the horrors of womanhood trapped within the prison house of the patriarchy. It is ultimately the monstrousness of gendered subjugation which lays the path for death and destruction. A result of the technologies of his craft, Eggers' vampire ultimately reads as not merely frightening, but as equally desirable and repulsive, actively circumnavigating previous anti-Semitic readings. While it may not be so straightforward to disentangle anti-Semitism from the vampire, it does indicate a revision to the ways in which the vampire and anti-Semitism are performing within such narratives. In a time when the ghost of anti-Semitism continues to haunt us, heeding a call to disentangle the two might help us grapple with the continued prevalence of actual anti-Semitism, as well as bad faith invocations of it by an administration looking to quell dissent and civil disobedience. To be able to critically engage with such realities requires an awareness of the technologies in operation. As the means of constructing otherness change with time, the body of the vampire challenges us to revise our reading of it, and thereby must critically engage understandings of otherness and how hegemonic forces surrounding us act to generate/shape such understandings. And here is a brief overview of my works cited. Thank you.
Wow, been on a roll today. This is good. So our final presenter, Rosa Scupine. Yes, I did it. From the University of California, Santa Cruz. Rosa is a graduate student in literature at University of California, Santa Cruz, with an interest in the weird and horrific world of the vampire, specializing in adaptation, the intersectionality of the monster with gender, race, and class, and its implication in today's cultural moment. The title of her paper, Nosferatu, A Symphony of Vampires.
Hello. Yeah, actually, the previous presentation, I am going to touch upon some of the same stuff, but then hopefully dig deeper into some of the specifics of, you'll find out. Okay, so as my title suggests, Robert Eggers' Nosferatu is a symphony, or a collection of utterances with a harmonious or pleasing effect. Eggers' film pulls from many sources, most obviously F.W. Murnau's 1922 Nosferatu and its 1979 adaptation by Werner Herzog, but also from the vampire that no one can get away from, Dracula. These references serve not only as the base structure of his plot, but feed into their meaning and continue ongoing dialogue started by Stoker. Layering Stoker, Murnau, Herzog, and Eggers creates a dense text and a new image of the whole. My main claim is, by dissecting Ellen and Nosferatu through the image of the palimpsest, highlights what survived, is created, and is received from Stoker's Dracula, Nosferatu, and Nosferatu the Vampire, hereafter referred to by their years. These nodes expose the breakdown of gender roles and the imperative time of women's bodily autonomy and fragile male authority. And here I do have tried to make a visual timeline of the differences, the year differences of each adaptation. Nosferatu is a unique text in that all of its iterations are adaptations, even the original 1922 film. 2024 is a palimpsestic adaptation, a framework I find on Linda Hutchian's description in A Theory of Adaptation as not secondary to its source text, but an intertextual product and consuming process for both creator and creature. According to the OED, a palimpsest is a manuscript in which later writing has been superimposed on earlier effaced writing. Simply put, a palimpsest is a document written on top of another document. The most elementary example of this is when someone doodles a mustache on a picture of someone, altering how the picture is viewed. According to Hutchian, adaptations are haunted by their source, its presence shadowing the one we are experiencing directly. It is the strange sensation where we cannot help but feel as though we have seen a movie before, even if it's different from what we remember. This is the palimpsest in action. They are mosaics of citations that are visible and accessible to audiences. This reception is necessary for an adaptation's survival, but this product comes with a layered pleasure that both Hutchian and Thomas Leach touch upon. While Hutchian names it palimpsestic doubleness and Leach palimpsestuous double consciousness, both speak to the experience of consuming an adaptation, as a confidence that comes with a sense of knowing what's about to happen next. Hutchian defines this doubled pleasure as an ongoing dialogue with the past, where more than one text is experienced, and knowingly so. Her emphasis on dialogue is vital because the audience does not watch the adaptation in a vacuum, but interrogates, praises, and comments on certain aspects to continue the ongoing conversation in the adaptation's respective field. In short, adaptation is not simply derivative, but generative and a site of cultural interrogation. What we are noticing within the palimpsestic approach is new writing that builds itself outwards from the old. It is the goal of both the audience and this analysis to track this historical movement of Count Orlok and Ellen in the eternal feat of understanding our obsession with this vampire. Through the framework of the palimpsest and its process of creation, survival, and reception, I will read 2024 as an adaptation that is in conversation with its predecessors and revives original elements in order to generate a renewed understanding of its textual echoes, visual citations, and structural transformations. Yeah, let me get some water. While my larger work with this topic touches on both Ellen and Thomas throughout Nosferatu's iterations, here I will concentrate on Ellen, who is Eggers' protagonist. Throughout its adaptations, Ellen's character moves closer to the foreground of the story, inevitably becoming its center. And I also just want to note, I put this quote from Dracula, and it's the scene of Mina describing Lucy after she's been staked. Speaking of Mina, in order to understand the palimpsest of Ellen, I shall briefly describe each layer, beginning with Stoker's Mina. Throughout Dracula, the men depend on Mina's submissiveness to maintain their sense of manhood, a reminder throughout that she could be much more, such as Van Helsing's praise for Mina's man brain. Dracula's attack on Mina has been read many ways, most notably how it offers her a chance to become like him, a being outside of society and its rules. She recounts how she was bewildered, and strangely enough, she did not want to hinder him, dismissing the latter feeling as one of Dracula's vampiric powers. This scene also develops a psychic connection between the two, which, alongside her skills in transcription, typing, and memorization of train schedules, makes her a tool in the defeat of Dracula. I think Halvorsen would probably say machine, but I digress. He becomes a portal into a world void of Victorian gendered parameters, and Mina cannot help but be tempted by it, even if she rejects it in favor of Jonathan and the crew of Light. And this may be what's really at stake in Dracula, writes David Skull, the rescue of an embattled male's deepest sense of himself as a male, and their only hope is Mina's submission. Her decision to stay with the men exhibit the self-sacrifice women must do to maintain male authority, which we will see throughout the various adaptations. In rewriting Mina, Henrik Galeen, writer for the 22 film, cut most of her characterizations, yet maintained her importance by giving her the power in defeating Orlok. Some interiority is shown when Thomas is in Transylvania, and Ellen sleepwalks across the edge of the balcony before being taken to bed. She shouts, "Hutter!" as Orlok looms over him, thousands of miles away, and causes Orlok to move away. The strangeness of a wife calling her husband by his last name is never touched upon. These two characters appear to have nothing in common besides being married to Jonathan/Thomas. Mina learns how to use a typewriter while Ellen plays with kittens, yet Ellen is the one with more authority. Ellen is a character infused with more personal free will, detached from an obligation to serve, yet it is her responsibility alone to reestablish the status quo. Ken Gilder calls it her civic duty. Lucy in 1979 remains overall unaltered in Herzog's version, and the scene where Orlok attacks Thomas in his bed is recreated exactly as it appears in 22. This superimposes Murnau's image on the palimpsest and reinforces Lucy's role in the Gerardian triangle between the vampire and the men. Further developing the themes from Ellen's somnambulism, Lucy warns Jonathan not to go to Transylvania, telling him she feels it like a force, an inner nameless deadly fear that something will go wrong. She is later distressed by Jonathan's absence, but these worries are ignored, along with other heeds of warning, which doom all those who do not listen. Dracula, in coming to Visburg, brings the breakdown of society through the death of all law enforcement and the chaos which ensues in the town square. As in 1897, but not 1922, Dracula speaks to Lucy, asking her to come to him and be his ally, casting a pitiful light on the classically nefarious creature. She rejects him and pursues her goal of saving her husband, who has been incapacitated by Dracula's bite. Despite the reemergence of Van Helsing in this version, he is of no use, and it is once again her sole responsibility to sacrifice herself and restore order in her community. As she tells Van Helsing, "I see I'll have to do this alone." By the time we get to Egger's film, there's an established formula to Ellen's character that he is interested in breaking away from. He slips a reference to the 1922's Ellen by naming her cat Greta after the actress in 22, and Ellen tells von Franz that Greta has no master nor mistress, defining how Eggers would like to view the original character. Unlike other versions, Ellen and Orlok had a previous relationship prior to the events of the story. When she calls out for him to come to me, reversing what occurs between Dracula and Lucy, she unknowingly enters into a pact that binds their spirit, flesh, and passion, so that his coming to Visburg is to complete their covenant. When Orlok visits Ellen in the night, he calls himself an appetite, nothing more, while she is an enchantress and his affliction. His correlation of appetite and affliction places Ellen in the position of vampire, seducing Orlok out of his grave and binding him to her instead of the other way around. It cannot be ignored that Orlok is the vampire, What is reflected in this scene is that she craves him or what he represents, whether or not she's willing to admit it. Orlok can best be described as what Deborah Lutz calls a dangerous lover, who brings obscurity, non-knowledge, and temporal interruption to the heroine. In meeting the dangerous lover, the heroine discovers her true self, her essential being, which she initially regards as a deeply threatening other. This reading is supported by her initial rejection of her darkness in favor of a marriage to Thomas, until Orlok's physical presence pressures her to embrace the aspects of herself first brought upon in her adolescence. As Orlok tells Ellen, he is not a deceiver, you deceive yourself. The sweet and innocent maiden which Stoker, Murnau, and Herzog designed and reinforced cannot survive in the times of modern audiences. Eggers reimagines the relationship between Orlok and Ellen to be more nuanced without demolishing any previous content. Eggers not only builds Ellen's character with new plot, but traces Ellen and Lucy's psychic powers from 22 and 79 to further depict her incompatible aspects with modern civilized society. Ellen characterizes these predictions as like a dream instead of a force that frightened her father and caused her isolation that would bring about Orlok. She foretells that Nock will send Thomas away and tells him not to go, as in 79, but he similarly dismisses them as unfounded worries. Further, Thomas tells Ellen never to tell others of her dreams in fear of their response, while von Franz contributes her possession to the fact that her lower animal functions dominate. Both cast her divinations as improper. What Ellen's palimpsest showcases is a woman choosing between the status quo and nonconformity. The vampire is only a catalyst. During the media circuit for Nosferatu, Eggers numerously mentioned Death in the Maiden, an artistic motif popular during the Romantic era that depicts a skeletal or corpse-like figure with a youthful and beautiful woman. Before I get into this quote, let me have some. Usually portrayed in an erotic mode, a common interpretation of the trope is that the maiden is resisting marriage by committing suicide in the arms of death itself. The strongest parallel of this motif in the film comes when Ellen tells Thomas of one of her dreams. It was our wedding. Standing before me, all in black, was death. But I was so happy, so very happy. We exchanged vows, we embraced, and when we turned round, everyone was dead. Father and everyone. The stench of their bodies was horrible, but I had never been so happy as that moment as I held hands with death. In her liminal dreamscape, where her prophecies stem, she imagines a marriage to death where Thomas is notably absent and death overwhelms the scene, yet she's happy. This scene foretells the ending of the film of Ellen and Orlok's wedding like death, but also speaks to Ellen's inner turmoil of desiring death over her life with Thomas. A life with Thomas is a life amongst men like Harding and Sievers, who do not view her as a person, but as a woman. Harding despises her for not subordinating to her husband, while Sievers objectifies her in the name of medicine. On the other side is Orlok, who can only deliver damnation and destruction. Both Ellen and Orlok stand at the boundary of society, but while his disturbance is external, hers is internal, meaning she can remain in society's clutches as long as she follows the rules. Norms must not be betrayed, ill feelings are not to be voiced, and women must listen to the men who want to protect them, even if they do not know better. This may remind you of the scene in Dracula when Mina wants to help, but they say, no, you're just weak, you have to stay. And that's when she gets attacked. It's very similar. In all the previous versions, her death constitutes the maintenance of this normal order, but Eggers' Ellen has the same fate with an entirely new meaning for her. Ellen's marriage to death is ultimately a coming to terms with herself and what 19th century Europe could offer her, and unlike her predecessors, rejecting it. Understanding Ellen's adaptation, what survives is her choice at the end, what is created is that this choice is for her, not others, and what is received is the reconsideration of what death can mean for her. Knowing that Ellen dies at the end, audiences are comforted by the fact that it means freedom from constrictive social morality. Despite it still being a self-sacrifice, she's afterwards described in the shooting script as calm, beatific, finally at peace, paralleling how Mina describes Lucy after the staking scene in Dracula that I showed before. She's not a martyr, but her own subject, and it's speculated whether it's her happy ending. I believe it is. Even if her life with Thomas would be happy, it would be an incomplete one where she would sacrifice a part of herself for that happiness. Death is complete and where she does not compromise. What the palimpsest reveals from considering the source text, adapters, and audience together is a hopeful image of the monster's relationship with the heroine, on the liberating possibilities then and now of succumbing to one's darkness. And as like a kind of a conclusion of sorts, the palimpsest not only intensifies the erosion of gender for Ellen, but it also removes Thomas's sense of power, masculine power. Utilizing Galen's script, Egger's ending subverts Stoker's resolve, where instead of getting his heroic moment, Thomas has no role in Orlok's defeat and cannot regain his masculinity. At the end of Dracula, Jonathan and Quincy Morris, the American cowboy who all adapters seem to agree is just not necessary, deal the killing blows to Dracula with phallic justice. Mina recalls Jonathan's great knife shearing through the throat of Dracula, while Morris stakes him with a Bowie knife. Jonathan's manhood is restored in his wife's eye through the cerebral castration of Dracula, and through this act, order is restored, Mina is purified once again, and they're free to reproduce. In Egger's version, the crew of Light goes searching for Orlok, but Thomas discovers their false hunt was only to keep him away from what Ellen needed to do. He is only a nuisance in the killing of Orlok, and has no real power to defeat the evil. The top text here is unearthing a feature from 3 layers down, returning to the discomposure that comes from the vampire's bite, which the 22 and 79 don't really dig into. While Thomas manages to escape the castle to return to his beloved, the confines of what it means to be a man has burst for him. The audience is most likely familiar with Egger's other films that typically end with a character dead or unable to return to their previous life. In reading Thomas's ending, their intertextual knowledge of Eggers as a writer and director may understand this not as a homecoming, but as a departure from where his life began. Orlok questions his manhood, and Ellen prevents him from regaining it. While Ellen found peace by her choice, Thomas will always be haunted by his lack of one. Emasculation has always been a feature of the vampire, dating back to Polidori's Lord Ruthven, yet speaks now as it did back then about how a man's sense of himself stems in their ability to protect women, and how destructive it can be to lose that. Viewers can use this reinterpretation to return to the easiness of Dracula's resolution. Can masculinity be so easily restored once it has been questioned? Perhaps not when the audience knows Dracula and Orlok will haunt the page, stage, and screen once more. Thank you.
I don't think I'm going to plan on standing here since the question is not going to be directed to me, but I will be actually pointing to people. So, any questions? Anybody have? Yes.
Have any of you seen the 1995 movie The Addiction?
Yes.
So your presentation reminded me a lot of that film, right? Because the whole thing about her sort of like not trying to eat people, but like also really enjoying it at the same time. And for any of you who haven't seen it, The Addiction is based off of a PhD graduate student who gets bitten, and then at the very end she kills her entire committee. So it's like
living the dream.
Yeah, and it's good. There's great people in it. It's not like it's like a super low budget. There's like Lily Taylor.
Is it Abel Ferreira?
Yeah. So I was thinking about that, and then I was also thinking about the film Naja, which is another really great one where it's a female vampire who's like taking over her family because her father's dead, and actually. So that one's a really good one too. But for The Addiction for me is like has always been sort of my perfect vampire film because it like ends with a point. Mm-hmm. I feel like a lot of times vampire films and vampire stories, and in a lot of ways even the original, it doesn't really end with a really good point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think like when you say the original, you mean like Dracula? Or,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dracula kind of ends with
There's
like normality is restored. Mina has been returned to her
Yeah,
proper
right.
role as like the mother of future generations of like white Anglo-Saxon
right, but to me
children.
that's not a good ending point.
Probably
right?
no.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not. I think
Yeah.
Mina could have done a lot better. That woman could memorize train schedules. I mean, like she's amazing. She is like the intellectual powerhouse in that novel. She's the one who figures out Dracula's plan for getting
Right.
home, like how he's going to get back to his castle. She's the one who figures out the most likely route he's going to take. Like she's the most brilliant person in that novel.
Yeah.
But of course, having to work within that kind of framework of the
Right.
cult of true
At the
womanhood,
time, right.
she
What I
has
was
to
talking
use
about
her
earlier.
gifts to
Yeah.
support these men in her
Yeah.
life. So if like you said, she has the man brain quote, where it's like she has a man's brain, she has the intellect of a man, but she has a woman's heart. So she's always channeling that intellect into supporting and caring for the men around her, which is like her proper position. But yeah, I love the addiction, and I think that's like, again, it's another form of appetite, and it's another form of destabilizing appetite, because again, I mean, the title The Addiction is pretty on the nose, but it uses vampirism as an analog for drug addiction, which
Right.
is another common use for vampirism. It's another common metaphor that vampirism is often bound up with, this idea that like the desire for blood is akin to some kind of addiction, typically some kind of drug addiction. And particularly in the 80s and 90s, I think with the AIDS crisis, that very much became kind of bound up with this sort of symbolics of blood. So blood as corruption, blood as, addiction. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting example. And again, I think it's that idea of the woman having to sort of mediate her appetite. And I think there's kind of an ambivalence as well surrounding appetite in a lot of these works. And I think you guys touched on that when you were talking about Ellen and Orlok. And it's interesting that I think Orlok says he is appetite, but so much of the film is sort of predicated on Ellen's appetite and her desires, which are the kind of destabilizing force within that context. So I think that's really fascinating as well. I don't know if you guys have. I am just one. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think the ideas about appetite that were really touched upon by yours, as well as how they kind of played out in our papers as well, indicate something really interesting to me about subjectivity, right? Like who gets to indulge their appetites and who doesn't, and how that sort of centers their experience and moving through the world, their personhood or being. This paper is a part of a larger project that really tries to mobilize the vampire, because I have to write a dissertation, so it's definitely interested in that. I mean, hearing your question made me think of Raw, which is another film that really kind of indulges appetite and the consumption of human flesh, and what it means. It's interesting.
And like cannibal women is also a whole kind of recent preoccupation in our culture. I mean, it's always been there, always been in some form, but with things like Raw, TV shows like Yellow Jackets and things like that, this idea of like the hungry, devouring woman.
I mean, the hunger from the 80s is like the pretty iconic film.
Yeah, which is also kind of bound up with kind of images of AIDS and addiction as well. But I was going to say something, but I think the jet lag has like descended upon me. But yeah, I think that question of subjectivity is really interesting, because it sort of determines whether an appetite is legitimate or illegitimate, appropriate or inappropriate. And I think what's interesting about the text that I discussed, Woman Eating, is that it is a first-person narrative voice. So as a result, because we're sort of bound to the subjectivity of the narrator, her appetite becomes less monstrous and more pleasurable because we're sort of experiencing it through her perspective. Whereas with so many of these other vampire texts, particularly these works with the ravenous female vampire, it's a third-person narrative voice where someone else is the narrator. So we are not privy to kind of the interiority of the female vampire. And so kind of engaging with it from that external position, it becomes it's monstrous and grotesque, as opposed to, something that is potentially, I don't want to say relatable, that's like a very simplistic term, but it's not something that we can necessarily, I want to say relatable because I'm very tired. But you guys know what I mean.
Thank you for these great papers. I have a question about
the relationship, I think it's mostly for Miranda and Rosa, between the woman who is a creature of appetite and the woman who is an agent of technology. And I'm thinking about, because Mina doesn't just know the timetables of the trains, but she is a typewriter. And as Friedrich Hitler reminds us, that was the 19th century term for the woman at the typewriter, right? So there's this act of transcription that kind of straddles embodied flesh and technological medium. And she also collates this narrative itself. So I'm thinking about whether it's possible in these later adaptations for women to be simultaneously flesh and knowledge in the wonder, and even in Stoker's Dracula, it has to be divided between two women because we can't sustain that. And maybe the addiction does allow that. Right. Yeah, she knows what she's doing.
I mean, she has all those student loans, so, might as well make it work for her.
Yeah, but I guess I'm just interested to hear you talk about this tension, especially Rosa. You leaned so heavily on the kind of textual form of Nosferatu and of Stoker, and how it's impossible to sort of distinguish the materiality of this layered palimpsest, right? A kind of text written upon itself, which is also like the vampiric body in its decay. But you can't really like take the story out of the medium. And so I guess I'm asking about whether the distinction between embodiment and inscription is gendered equally in different historical moments, and if it's gendered across the male vampire and the female vampire, like what your thoughts are. I know that's big.
It's a big question. I was really drawn to your point about knowledge and passion. I forgot the other word that you used, appetite, because we get that very strange but beautiful moment where von Franz says, like, oh, in like ancient times you would have been like the goddess of Isis or the oracle of Isis, but like now in modern times, like, you're just whatever you are. I forgot exactly what he said, but I think that it's like a great insight into, I think Nina especially, of like her circumstances are more about where she is and when she is than about her own self. And I lost my train of thought because I really want to answer your kind of bigger questions, but I'll chew on it.
Okay. Oh, yes. Yeah, well, yeah, kind of vampiric.
So she's a vampire, but she's not a vampire, right?
It's like she's the vagina
It's
dentata.
dentata.
Yeah.
So it's like
That's like a very literal, like embodied appetite. Like, yeah. 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 I'm trying to think what the French one from the 80s could be. But yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, that idea of like the vampire kind of split between, or the woman is kind of split between appetite and knowledge, because it comes back again to that binary system we have, for categorizing the relationship between mind and body as essentially kind of gendered. So women are, and like, it's interesting, again, I keep coming back to that man's brain quote, because I just think it's brilliant. Like, I love Van Helsing and his weird, like, phrasing of things, but I think it's so interesting that he says man's brain and woman's heart. So again, it's like the man is associated with the brain, with the mind, and the woman is associated with the heart and with, with caring. I think one of the things in the text that I was talking about, I think initially in the text, the protagonist is kind of wedded to this mind-body division, and she has this kind of, I think she feels that her body, because of its kind of complex racial and class identity, is sort of excessive, even though she doesn't kind of term it in that way. she kind of sees it as excessive and something that she almost desires to have disappear. So she talks about like the whiteness of her skin, or the whiteness of her imagined skin, that, you know, the sun, she sees the sun as burning her as if she, you know, doesn't have any melanin, as if she's pure white. And then later on, when she drinks milk as opposed to blood, which she thinks will harm the demon, she imagines her skin becoming kind of transparent, and she can see her veins. So I think initially she's very wedded to this idea of the binary opposition between the body and the mind. But I think, you know, what's interesting in that case is that I think she kind of eventually, and I think it happens quite suddenly in the context of this particular novel, but she does eventually, I think, get to a point where she's able to sort of reconcile those and kind of see herself as a whole as opposed to that kind of division. But that's definitely, I think, in the 19th century texts in particular, that division is very much there, because like you said, you have Lucy as body, Nina as mind as well, that, you know, that's so dependent on that particular division.
Yeah, I think there is something interesting about the gendered relationship to body and knowledge, has kind of been touched on. I mean, especially with the 2024 version, seeing the way in which Ellen's body experiences things and has knowledge of phenomenon in a different place, right? Like her body reacts to interactions. So she's literally an embodiment of uncanny knowledge. And I think, like, in a biblical sense, right, the fruit of knowledge being bitten by Eve, I think there's this long-standing tradition of knowing that if you're talking in terms of binaristic gendered flesh, the femme body has a capacity beyond that of the man's, like woman's intuition, a pregnant body containing two brains at the same time, right? Like, I think there's all of this really rich ways in which the vampire has something that fucks with gender, and binary is kind of unlocks.
And that, like, that makes sense as well, because of that whole idea. I mean, even if you think of like Barbara Creed's work on the vampire, and this idea that the vampire is always feminized, even when the vampiric body is male, because of its association with blood. Mm-hmm. So, like, well, it's a creature that penetrates, and, you know, it penetrates, so it's in that active role. It also receives fluids, so it's kind of taking on the conventionally feminine role. But at the same time, its association with blood marks it as what she calls like a menstrual monster. Mm-hmm. So there's that idea that, like, even when it's male, the vampire is always feminized anyway.
Mm-hmm. And what Ellen knows is that she wants this thing. You know, she says to this whole, I mean, you do that for me. Right? I mean, it's like found up. I mean, yes, it's sacrificial, but that uncanny knowing of her body and how much it lingers on her orgasmic responses throughout, like, really, I think, strange position that is very
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thing is, because in that scene where Thomas and Ellen have like arguably very awkward sex with each other, like, I know it's kind of shown to be very passionate, but it feels very awkward to me. But she keeps saying, "Bite me on my chest, bite me on my chest," and that's how Orlok, like, that's like the first thing he does is he bites her on the chest. So I do think, on top, and really going back to Deborah Lutz, not only does Ellen kind of have this knowledge, but Orlok has knowledge about her that's only accessible because he is this, like, again, dangerous lover, dangerous other, whatever you want to call it. So it's like a cycle of knowledge.
Just because you said cycle of knowledge, the Eggers version uses the motif of the Oribus, like the snake eating its own tail, in a way that I think, I mean, part of my work, dissertation-wise, is thinking about a monstrous phenomenology, and, you know, the Merleau-Ponty Mobius strip is one that I think you can see between body, flesh, knowledge, the interior, the exterior, is something I'm particularly interested in.
I have like 5 more questions now because I'm so fascinated by all these things, and I've been looking forward to this panel for ages. It's not just quick. So thank you all for sharing your work. But I'm thinking about like cyclicality of bodily knowledge. I heard you mention menstruation a couple times. I'm really interested in menstrual symbolism in the vampire narrative. And I was writing about that when I saw Nosferatu and thinking about the vagina dentata. And when I saw the mustache, my first thought was not masculinity. It was, oh, it's like pubic hair. And then I Googled that and nobody else had the same opinion. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about like menstrual symbolism kind of interacting with the tropes of masculinity and in general gender subjectivity in these works. And also as it relates to appetite. I know Lydia doesn't experience menstruation, but I also, like, oftentimes, even myself, I'll be like, oh, I'm so hungry, I'm on my period. So maybe you could talk about that in your work specifically.
You're reading that book at the moment, aren't you? Yeah. I'm so sorry that I spoke.
That's okay, it's okay.
But it's still very much worth exploring. And also I feel like you might have a different interpretation to me, especially my theory that she's not actually a vampire, but just sort of thinks she's a vampire or has been led to believe it because of the environment that she grew up in. But yeah, I think that's interesting. I think the fact that she doesn't menstruate, it's really interesting because she talks about the fact that her mother gave birth to her. So even though her mother is a vampire and shouldn't menstruate and shouldn't ovulate, she nevertheless conceives and gives birth to Lydia, which again kind of ties into my theory that they're not really vampires. But I think the lack of menstruation or her kind of inability to menstruate, I think it kind of ties in with her preoccupation with purity, because she doesn't necessarily lament it. She kind of frames it in a very matter-of-fact way. And there is this kind of theory that, again, like, I'm not sure how I feel about it. Leslie Haywood and others write about it, but there's this kind of idea that, again, returning to those binary oppositions of kind of flesh and spirit, that, you know, part of the anorexic logic is a desire to transcend a specifically feminine body and the kind of sex attributes of the feminine body. And I think in Lydia's case, I think for her, it speaks to a purity and also the sort of the regulations and rituals that she's constructed around her imbibing of blood. So she's very kind of careful and very meager and very sparse in terms of what she ingests, in terms of the blood she ingests. And yeah, I think the fact that she doesn't then menstruate, obviously kind of, again, speaks to that kind of purity that she's preoccupied with attaining. But it's really interesting because, again, as I just mentioned, vampires are so frequently bound up with menstrual blood, and this idea of the vampire as a menstrual monster, and particularly its association with nighttime and cyclicality, and according to Creed, the moon as well, so that kind of links it to menstruation. So frequently vampires and female vampires as well, I think there's often this image of like red lips that sort of signify a kind of, like the bloody female genitalia of like the menstruation woman, like even, Bram Stoker's voluptuous weird sisters. So I think there is this kind of menstrual symbolism that's very common to vampires, but it's interesting how in this case the vampire is kind of extricated from that.
Also, it's just interesting that they call menstruation a curse, and then they also call vampires a curse.
Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. And like, I guess that, all those ideas around consent as well, like, in the same way that we can't really exercise that much control over our bodies, vampirism,
The two films that always strike me about this is Pitch Black, number one, right? Monsters, and then
Yeah.
And also their sexuality that was there because, I've never really figured out if about a trans character or a passing character. It's never really clarified. And then, and the other one is a film, and I don't even know the name of it. I saw it when I was so young. It was an Australian film about a bus full of children who got kidnapped by these men and taken into like a cave. And one of the children starts menstruating. And it becomes really kind of like a problem for the teachers who are trying to be calm and collected,
And also, I guess there's something about knowledge there as well, because there's so commonly that trope in popular culture of like girls who are unaware of what is happening to their body, and this idea, that the body's almost,
and there's so many layers of gender in
Yeah.
And then the female teachers, and then the young children, and it's amazing filming. I'll never been able to figure out.
I'm gonna Google that later.
I've tried so
Yeah.
many times. I'm like, Australian bus full of
Cave.
children.
Menstruation.
I just wanted to make one more comment. It's not about Nosferatu, but if you're interested in menstruation in the vampire, unfortunately, Anne Rice is your gal.
Oh my god, I know exactly what you're referring to.
Yeah, I was just, there's a traumatizing scene in the 5th book of the Vampire Chronicles series that has to do with menstruation that I actually detested. I thought it was despicable. But nonetheless, I also think Claudia is a very interesting figure when you're talking about menstruation in the vampire because she never gets her period.
She's like, she's about, what, 5 years old?
She's 5 years old in the book, 8 in the movie, 14 in the show.
Yeah.
Everybody seems to agree that she needs to be aged up, but even in the television show, she hadn't gotten. At least we have no indication that she had gotten her period yet. She doesn't make any comment about it.
So she's stuck in this point where she's never able to reach that sexual maturity.
Yeah, and so that's kind of like her tragedy is that she laments about it. She talks about it directly. I think more explicitly. Well, I'd say more explicitly in the novel, just about like, you cursed me, like I will never be a woman. And then so what does she do? She seeks out a mother, but it's also the seeking out of like a voluptuous body.
Yeah, and she's also she's killing women as well and keeping their bodies as well as sort of like, I don't know, they always become like dolls to her or something that she gets to play at being the woman that she was never able to become.
The doll motif.
Yeah.
Says they're just pretend.
Yeah. Poor Claudia.
Hi. I just I'm not sure if this is like a fully formed question, but I guess I'm like kind of maybe connecting some threads between the three and kind of curious like your thoughts, but I guess kind of where maybe in all of your works does or is there a question of like disability and mental illness as a, I mean, of course in like anorexia as a not just as like a concept, but as almost like symptoms or the way that it's acted upon or treated in different types of society, or clearly in like Victorian society, there's like not an understanding of physical or mental health in women in particular. And then even now, like, and when we think about it now and how women are still, and femme folks, and honestly, like non-binary folks, if we think about like Mina as man-like in some ways, like, and then also the question of homosexuality and queerness as a mental illness, and even like suicidal ideation or self-destruction, which one might say that is what Ellen does in the end. She chooses death. So I guess I'm curious where disability and mental illness might come into and also queerness and other in that relationship might come into your studies. Thanks.
That's really interesting.
Well,
do you want to go?
Sure. I mean, just to start, I think there's something that's really tied to the development of sciences and like psychoanalysis, especially with the original Dracula, right? You sort of have this emergence of ways of applying scientific thought and medical thought to unexplained phenomenon, medically, including mental health. Originally the term homosexual, right, is a medical term that was used to diagnose these things. So if we attitudes and understandings of these ways of being or kind of interwoven again with that sort of egg, chicken, Ouroboros, like which came first, behavior versus being and all of that sort of thing gets really wrapped up with the vampire. I mean, the original, I mentioned briefly that Michael Chalmers noted the bodily desecration of corpses thought to be vampires had to do with the fact that like corpses, when they decompose, they bloat, right? They get big. So people would look at these bodies and be like, it's fat. It got fatter since we buried it. It must be eating. And so the way in which the vampire is tied to medical and scientific understandings of phenomenon is really, really kind of intrinsic in a lot of ways. And I think in terms of the way it gets handled in the 2024 version, I just look back to them tying her to that bed, right? Like, Eggers really embraces the fact that like her experience, her knowledges are real in the world of this, narrative, but they don't make sense, and Kara Keeling has a lot of really great work on common sense, specifically Black femme common sense, but I think it applies to the way in which we understand these different things. And from the medical perspective, things are being revised, right? Websites are being edited to remove knowledge, like all of these things. The burning of the books started with trans science in Nazi Germany. Like, we can really recognize that there's epistemic violence tied up with the vampire, as well as just our own understandings of medicine, gender, and all of these other things.
It's interesting that the vampire, as we know it, like thinking of the vampire as a literary phenomenon, as opposed to sort of all these reports that you're getting from, the far edges of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 18th century. But the vampire is like a literary phenomenon, is contemporary with the development of these new scientific and medical disciplines that are preoccupied with sort of categorizing and pathologizing and medicalizing behaviors that deviate in any way from the norm. And like, it's interesting that, and I mean, you can see it in Nosferatu, particularly the 2024 version. It's interesting that a number of critics have pointed out that the behaviors that, let's say, women like Lucy, or more Lucy than Mina, sort of demonstrate in a novel like Dracula, they're often aligned with modes of pathologizing female sexuality that emerged in the 19th century. So, quite a few critics have obviously pointed out that some of Lucy's behaviors, reflect hysteria diagnoses, even though like hysteria was like capacious enough as a diagnosis to embody all sorts of things, but also nymphomania. A few people have read Lucy's kind of wasting away and then becoming voluptuous in death, which transforms into a vampire in terms of like eating disorders as well. And anorexia was also categorized in the 19th century. So it's interesting that this is a period where we are categorizing and medicalizing any female deviations from the norm. And one of the key things about a lot of these deviations, and one of the key reasons they needed to be treated often in kind of these violent and monstrous ways, was that these illnesses, some of them were, some of them weren't, were often disruptive on a kind of social and familial level. So often, if you read about hysteria, they talk about the impact and the destructive influence hysteria and the hysterical woman has on her family. Similarly, like anorexic girls I think someone described them somewhere as like being like vampires, or like sucking the blood or draining the life from their families. So again, a lot of this stuff is kind of characterized in terms of like the social disruption, rather than the individual's experience. But like in the novel that I was talking about, she never gets any kind of treatment. She's very much alone, and she's able to isolate herself in a way that is actually kind of characteristic of certain eating disorders, where individuals will kind of cut themselves off from society so that they can continue to adhere to very rigid routines and things like that. So, which again, I guess is kind of, aligns with the vampire. She kind of hides away in her dark room.
And a lot of that pathologizing also has to do with control, right? Societal control and those power dynamics.
Yeah, actually kind of bouncing off of that. Because, I mean, the one, like, mental illness, really, that I don't even want to call it that we get in Nosferatu is somnambulism, which I brought up a couple of times. But because, like, Victorians were obsessed with somnambulism, like, it's in so many Gothic tales. I think there's, like, there's a short story called Somnambulism, and it's about a guy sleepwalking and killing people, and it's this like fear of the unconscious that kind of fuels this like, no, I really want like more and more, I want to look at somnambulism more. But kind of referencing an article I just read that kind of touches on what we've been talking about was I think it's called Lacan and Carmilla. I want to say it's Ken Gelder.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, but it's pretty much talking about how the patriarchy gains power by naming, and that's what the men in Carmilla are doing. They name her as a vampire, and thus that's when they're able to destroy her, is once they've established her as vampire and thus threat. So I definitely agree that like it's all about in the naming of things, like how Sievers and Harding label her as wrong. Von Franz is actually very like, we all love Willem Dafoe.
Yeah.
Von Franz sees her as visionary, as like something else, like immediately is like, untie her, like, why would you treat her like that?
Then she shall rave.
Yeah, let her do it, and like him with all the rats, and like, it's how it was supposed to be. Like, so I definitely recommend checking out that. It has nothing to do with mental illness. Oh.